Women in the USSR, from Revolution to Collapse, 1917-1991. Topic 1. Revolution and early Soviet experiment in the gender policy, 1917-1925. This period is one of the most radical social experiments in the modern history. The Bolsheviks did not want only to change government, they wanted to transform family life, motherhood, marriage, work, and gender roles. Did the early USSR attempt one of the world's first state-sponsored projects of women's liberation? The Bolsheviks believed that women's liberation was essential for building a socialist society. According to Marxist theory, the traditional family was not simply a private institute based on love, but an economic structure that kept women dependent on men. Friedrich Engels, whose work strongly influenced the Bolsheviks, argued that women's oppression began with private property and the patriarchal family. Communist ideologists believed that unpaid domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, and childcare trapped women in what Vladimir Lenin, called household slavery. Before the 1917 revolution, women in the Soviet Empire had limited legal rights and were economically dependent on fathers or husbands. However, by the early 20th century, women already formed a major part of the industrial workforce. Historians estimated that women made up more than 40% of workers in some sectors by 1917. The Bolsheviks argued that a woman could not be truly free while financially dependent on husband. Therefore, they connected women's emancipation directly to employment and participation in collective labor. One of the most important Bolshevik ideologists on women's issues was Alexandra Kollontai. She argued that a woman could achieve equality only in a society where labor was socialized and women participated equally in production. Kollontai famously wrote, "Woman will only become free and equal in a world where labor has been socialized and where communism has been victorious." She also criticized the traditional family and promoted the idea of new relationships based on equality rather than economic dependence. The Bolsheviks introduced some of the most radical gender reforms in the world at the time. In 1918, Soviet Russia adopted the Code of Marriage and Family and Guardianship. This law legalized civil marriage, simplified divorce, granted equal rights to husband and wives, recognized children born outside marriage as legal equal, reduced the legal authority on the patriarchal family. The 1980 Constitution of Soviet Russia also formally recognized political equality between men and women. In 1920, Soviet Russia became the first country in the world to legalize abortion performed in state hospitals. Women also received paid maternity leave and legal protection in the workplace. Lenin repeatedly argued that socialism must involve women directly in politics, labor, and public administration. He insisted that a real communism could begin only when domestic labor was transformed into collective social labor. Communist activists therefore encouraged women to join factories, trade unions, political organizations, and local Soviet institutions. Another important Bolshevik figure was Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife and major educator with the Soviet system. She promoted literacy campaigns and women's education, arguing that political consciousness and education were necessary for emancipation. However, the reality was more complicated than Bolshevik theory promised. Also, millions of women entered the workplace during the 1920s and 1930s. They often faced a double burden: factory labor combined with domestic responsibilities at home. Historians note that communal kitchens and public child care never fully replaced traditional family labor. Under Joseph Stalin, some early revolutionary ideas about family and sexual freedom were reduced, and the Soviet state began promoting more traditional family values. Nevertheless, the Bolshevik Revolution transformed women's legal status more rapidly than almost any other society of the era. Soviet ideology permanently linked women's emancipation with economic independence, labor participation, and state-supported equality. How marriage changed overnight? After the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Soviet leaders attempted to transform marriage from a religious institution into a civil contract, controlled by the state. The Soviet government transferred marriage registration from the church to local state institution known as the ZAGS offices, the Russian abbreviation from Department for the Registration of Act of Civil Status. Beginning with the Decree on Civil Marriage of December 1917, only marriages registered at ZAGS offices had legal validity in Soviet Russia, Russian. Church weddings could still be performed privately, but they no longer had official legal status in matters such as inheritance, divorce, or property rights. The Decree on Civil Marriage of December 1917 declared that only marriages registered by state authorities were legally valid, while church weddings became private religious ceremonies without legal power. As a result, the number of civil marriages increased rapidly in major cities such as Moscow and Petrograd during the 1920s, although many peasants in rural areas continued to prefer traditional church weddings. Historians note that older generation often distrusted civil marriage because they believed that a union without a church blessing lacked moral legitimacy. Orthodox religious thinker and clergy strongly criticized Soviet family reforms, arguing that easy divorce and secular marriage would destroy the spiritual foundation of a family and encourage moral instability. Patriarch Tikhon publicly condemned Bolsheviks' anti-religious policies and defended the sacramental nature of church marriage. The 1918 Code on Marriage, the Family and Guardianship introduced one of the easiest divorce systems in the world, allowing either spouse to request divorce without providing guilt such as adultery or abuse. Divorce rates rose significantly during the 1920s, especially in urban areas where common causes including economic hardship, migrations, unemployment, housing shortages, domestic violence, and changing attitudes towards personal freedom after the revolution. Before 1917, divorce in Imperial Russia was extremely rare, because the Orthodox Church allowed it only under limited conditions such as adultery, exile, or abandonment. In contrast, after the 1918 Code on Marriage, the Family and Guardianship, either spouse could request divorce through a local civil court or registration office without proving moral guilt. Historians estimate that divorce rate increased dramatically during the 1920s, especially in urban centers, where revolutionary social changes weakened traditional family structures. In Moscow during the middle 1920s, some reports suggested that nearly half of registered marriages eventually ended in divorce, a figure that shocked both conservatives and foreign observers. The most common reasons for divorce included economic hardship, housing shortage, migration during industrialization, domestic conflicts, alcoholism, and changing expectations about romantic relationships. Soviet newspapers and courts reported cases where women were abandoned by husband after informal unions, revealing that legal equality did not always protect women economically or socially. Soviet legislation was far more progressive than many Western countries at the time. For example, in the 1920s, many American states still made divorce difficult. Married women in several European countries faced legal restriction on property and employment, and illegitimate children often lacked equal inheritance rights. In contrast, Soviet law recognized children born outside marriage as a legal equal, granted women equal rights in divorce and property matters, and legalized civil marriage decades before some predominantly Catholic European society accepted similar reform. Abortions were officially permitted only in state hospitals and had to be performed by trained medical doctors rather than midwives or legal practitioners. The Bolsheviks legalized abortions largely because illegal underground abortions had become extremely widespread during the World War I, the Revolution, and the Civil War. Soviet doctors reported thousands of deaths and serious infections caused by unsafe procedures performed in private apartments or village homes. Bolshevik leaders also connected abortion policy to women's health, claiming that socialist medicine should protect women rather than punish them. The Soviet government therefore allowed abortions in public hospitals free of charge under medical supervision. At the same time, communist ideologists believed abortion would eventually disappear in a prosperous socialist society with stable living conditions and social support for mothers. Most women seeking abortions were workers, poor urban residents, single mothers, domestic servants, or wives struggling to support families during economic crisis. Many women explained that they could not afford another child because of unemployment, hunger, housing shortage, or abandonment by a husband. The new Soviet woman. The Bolsheviks linked women's liberation directly to labor and argued that employment was necessary for true equality. Soviet officials publicly described abortion as a temporary social necessity rather than a positive ideal. The new Soviet woman was expected to work in factories, offices, schools, hospitals, and government institutions alongside men. Communist leaders believed that collective labor would destroy the economic foundations of patriarchy and transform social relations. Soviet propaganda constantly repeated their message: working woman equals liberated woman. The ideal new Soviet woman was educated, productive, politically active, healthy, liberate, and independent. Soviet propaganda portrayed her as a worker, teacher, engineer, student, activist, or doctor, rather than as simply a housewife. However, different social groups reacted to this idea very differently. Urban working class women were often the most supportive audience for Soviet gender reforms. Many factory workers welcomed easier divorce, access to education, legal equality, and employment opportunities because these reforms expanded their economic independence. Young women in cities were especially attracted to the modern clothing, literacy campaigns, political participation, and professional careers promoted by Soviet culture. At the same time, many male workers reacted ambiguously to women's emancipation. Officially, communist ideology demanded gender equality, but in everyday life, many men still expected women to perform traditional domestic duties after factory work. This contradiction created tension inside Soviet families. Among the Soviet intelligentsia, teachers, journalists, and party activists, the new Soviet woman was often celebrated as a symbol of modernization and revolutionary progress. Communist newspapers described female workers and students as a proof that socialism was creating a new civilization-free form, bourgeois backwardness. In contrast, peasant communities often reacted negatively or cautiously to these ideas. Rural women frequently remained tied to traditional family expectations, religions, and patriarchal authority. Many peasants viewed Soviet ideas about easy divorce, civil marriage, and women working outside the home as a tax on family stability and village morality. The Russian Orthodox Church strongly criticized Bolsheviks' gender ideology. Religious leaders argued that the Soviet state was destroying motherhood, weakening marriage, and encouraging moral disorders. Young people were usually more receptive to the new Soviet woman than older generations. Soviet youth organizations promoted physical fitness, literacy, political activism, and collective participation for girls as well as boys. By 1925, the Soviet government used many forms of visual propaganda to advertise this new family identity. The most common types of Soviet advertisement were political posters, magazine illustrations, newspapers, propaganda films, workers' club expectations, literacy campaign materials. One famous style of Soviet poster contrasted the old woman and the new Soviet woman. The old figure was often shown wearing traditional peasant clothing, standing near a church or inside a dark home. The new woman appeared confident, educated, and active in public socialist life. Soviet magazines such as Работница, the woman worker, and Крестьянка, the peasant woman, became important propaganda tools promoting female literacy, hygiene, childcare advice, labor participation, and communist political values. Soviet visual culture emphasized strength, discipline, and social usefulness over luxury or beauty. This differs sharply from many American advertisements of the 1920s, which often portrayed women primarily as consumers, fashionable housewives, or symbol of glamour and domestic comfort. While American advertising promoted cosmetics, household products, and feminine elegance, Soviet propaganda promoted tractors, factories, books, and political participation. However, the Soviet revolutionary transformation reached cities more successfully than villages. In rural areas, peasant traditions remained deeply rooted, and many village women continued to live according to patriarchal customs. Some rural women feared that Soviet reforms threatened family stability and religious morality. Others simply lacked access to school, healthcare, transportation, and employment opportunities available in large cities. Historians therefore argue that the Soviet Revolution created two different realities for women, one more modern and revolutionary in urban centers, and another more traditional in the countryside. Even so, literacy campaigns, collective farms, and state education gradually expanded Soviet influence into rural communities during the 1920s and 1930s years.